Good morning, everyone. Apologies for traffic in the parkway, but hey. And thank you for coming. I'm Jane Harmon. I think you all know this. Brain cell depleted, recovering politician, president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted that you're here. I see lots of regulars in this audience, and you're right to follow Robin Wright and the things that she does here. We're so proud of the fact that she's connected to us. 3 years ago, I wrote the foreword to a brilliant book that Robin put together called The Islamists Are Coming. Islamist parties had won elections in Tunisia and Egypt, and it was exciting to think that we had turned a corner and we were heading for a chapter of inclusive politics that reflected the bottom-up uprisings across the Middle East. 3 years on, the record is mixed. Many in Egypt, you all know this, have decided that the Muslim Brotherhood is toxic. Many of its supporters are now imprisoned or have gone underground. In Tunisia, Ennahda is part of a more tolerant political landscape, and actually many moves by the Ennahda party, and especially its founder, Rashid Ghannouchi, are impressive. But it ain't over till it's over. And as I reflect on how different developments have been in each country and across the Arab world, I strongly endorse Robin's judgment that the Islamists aren't one size fits all. She pointed out in the early book that there were 50 flavors. I think it's even more complicated than that. And let me add that terror groups like ISIL, I strongly believe this anyway, groups that claim to speak for Islam don't. Their barbaric practices make them, in my view, anti-Islamic. So just because the leaders and followers of a movement say they are Muslim, in my view, their movement, an Islamic movement. I don't know what Robin thinks. We're going to hear in a minute. So this reunion of contributors to Robin's original book is as timely and urgent today as the work was in 2012. She is a true Wilson Center rock star, and she has my personal email, and all day and all night I get her latest offerings. I don't think she sleeps. I'm sure she doesn't eat. And, Robin, please, just slow down, 2%. A distinguished scholar here and at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Her career as a journalist brought her to more than 140 countries. Is that still accurate, or is it we're now up to 180? Well, whatever.
More, yeah.
And more. And if you don't already subscribe to The New Yorker, her dispatches are spectacular. That magazine is expensive for a reason, because getting to read Robin is a real privilege. We know everybody else here too, so I might as well say something about all of them. David Ottaway is a senior scholar and one of the center's sharpest minds on the Middle East. We're lucky to have a twofer, David and Marina, here at the Wilson Center, and the two of them are an extraordinary team. We're also joined by Les Campbell, who has shown me some of the garden spots in the world as he has directed NDI activities there. I've been an election observer on at least 8 NDI missions. 2 of them were in Tunisia and Egypt. Yes, there was a free and fair election a long time ago in Egypt, in case you missed it. And Les has been doing this for over 20 years, incredible deep background in civil society and government reform. In fact, Les, you're the guy who set up for me a meeting in Yemen some years ago when I was a member of Congress with a number of the opposition parties. And it really was interesting to see that there was a deeper civil society in Yemen than in many other countries. I didn't know that. Let's just pray that it lasts past this latest chapter in Yemen. So, last but not least, how could we ever ignore Nathan Brown of the Elliott School of International Affairs? Nathan was one of our fellows a few years ago. That was the high point of his life. But he still continues to be a brilliant observer of Islamist movements and in the political process. And all 4 are experienced, nuanced voices. This is what the Wilson Center does best. We do the deep dives on the issue, behind the headlines, ahead of the headlines, and try to look around the corners in terms of where the future's going. And I just, if If I could say just one more thing about Robin. Uh-oh, she's wincing. I mean, Robin, you're always the gold standard. You always do this well. And it is a real privilege to introduce this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. I wish my mom had heard that. You are, as always, very generous. And as always, you are a visionary. You and Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program, have had real vision in endorsing this project when it was first started, 4 years ago now, and understanding that the Islamist phenomena is arguably the most energetic and dynamic force in the Middle East today. That's not saying it's good or bad, but what it is in lots of different ways, and that it's really important for us at every level and in every country to try to figure out who they are, what they're doing, how to deal with them in different ways. The original product was this book. We've now, we turned it into a website. For those who couldn't afford to pay for the book, the entire original book is available online. But to supplement it, we add up to a dozen new articles every week. And we have also started a newsletter that will go out regularly. For anyone who's interested in a little bit of background, we did a fact sheet. It's available at the front desk. Take it. It'll show you how to sign up for the newsletter and give you a little bit of a taste of what's in the book. I'm really honored to be on this panel with three of my colleagues whom I respect so very, very much in so many ways. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview to get us all started, and then I'm going to turn to each one of them to do the countries in which they are specialists and which they have written about. I think one of the important things to understand is that this trend, which took off originally a century ago now, when a disgruntled worker on the Suez Canal Company mobilized 6 of his colleagues in what became the Muslim Brotherhood, today the granddaddy of all Islamist movements that has produced 80 offshoots. Islamism has been transformed in that century in many, many different forms. Appropriately, today is the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. It's 36th anniversary. And that, again, is a different kind of manifestation of the Islamist phenomena as people in the region turn to their faith to either define political goals or define values around which they want to build new political systems. Now, it's important, I think, to understand the generations. So I want to identify the 3 generations since the Islamist trend really took off in solid political form in the 1970s. The first generation is what I call the seeds. They were in the 1970s and the 1980s. And we saw it manifested in different ways, where the Iranians, during their revolution, introduced political Islam, where the Afghanistan war against the Soviet occupation gave us the Afghan Arabs and Osama bin Laden. Hezbollah in Lebanon was born during that period. Hamas among the Palestinians, Islamic Jihad among the Egyptians. This was the first period where we witnessed the first modern suicide bombings and hostage takings. The second generation was from the 1990s through the first decade of the 21st century, and ending specifically with the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011. And I do call this the 9/11 generation. The spectrum of Islamists, and I make this distinct from the secular politicians, the Islamist spectrum evolved in very different directions during the second generation. The Iraq War produced a whole new breed and a whole new issues around which to spawn jihadism. But the first generation of Islamists also matured and took very different turns. Hezbollah ran for parliament in Lebanon. The Muslim Brotherhood ran under cover of other parties for parliament in Egypt. Iran produced a reform movement and the election of President Khatami, who proposed a form of glasnost with the outside world and bringing down the walls of mistrust. In other words, very quickly, you've seen the full array of Islamist activities separate from what was going on among the traditional secular parties. The third generation has been since 2011, and they have expanded even further. The spectrum has become even wider. The Islamists in some areas have experienced a meteoric rise to top political jobs. We saw it in Egypt and Tunisia, in the most democratic elections to ever take place in those countries. But then just as rapidly, they experienced a meteoric fall from political favor. And on the other extreme, the militants became much more aggressive and more ambitious and more brutal than any of their predecessors. This third generation could well define what happens over the next 15 years. Today we have two very contrasting phenomena. We have an Islamic republic from the first generation. We have an Islamic state, a modern caliphate, produced by the third generation. And that is a microcosm of the scope of the Islamist phenomena. I want to go back to that in a minute, but I want to use Tunisia as a microcosm very quickly. I know David's going to talk about this more at length, but Les and I were international monitors at the presidential election, and I have to say NDI runs an amazing election monitoring operation in December. And the thing that really struck us was that this is the country where the Arab Spring was born, in a little town called Sidi Bouzid. Tunisia produced arguably the most moderate Islamist movement that was willing to work with two secular parties. Excuse me. It compromised on the Constitution on critical issues. It stepped aside after political politicians. Hang on, I need to get a drop. I'm recovering. The party, the Ennahda Party, the Renaissance Party, stepped aside when two opposition politicians were assassinated. They had nothing to do with it, but they stepped aside because of the furor that they had not been able to secure society, and it opted not to run a presidential candidate so that it wouldn't fall into the same kind of divisive issues that brought down the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And after the second parliamentary elections last fall, it agreed to be a party to the new government and to accept just a very low level and single position. Yet Tunisia has also produced the highest number of foreign fighters for ISIS, over 3,000, according to the government, with another 8,000 to 9,000 that have been turned away at the border. That's just a staggering contrast. One of the things Les and I found in Tunisia was that the lowest voter turnout, thank you, was among the youth. And the lowest single voter turnout in the whole country was in Sidi Bouzid, where the Arab Spring began. And so this is this is very telling. One of the young men in Sidi Bouzid had told me at the fruit place where Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. He lamented, he said, "We have many more freedoms today, but we have no more jobs." And that's one part of it, not all of it, but that's one of the factors. Now, I want to get back to this comparison between the Islamic State and the Islamic Republic, because it's also very telling in terms of the scope of Islamism today. On the surface, they both want a pure idealized government based on Sharia law. But the differences are not just that one is Shiite and one is Sunni. Ooh, that's hot. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born of a revolution against a monarchy It has a republican constitution that has incorporated large chunks of Napoleonic law borrowed from France and Belgium. It has recognized borders. It's a member of the United Nations and several international organizations. It recognizes most, but not all, other faiths and allows their proportionate representation in Parliament. Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, not Baha'i, but the other three. And its economy relies on international trade and energy. The Islamic State, on the other hand, is, as you can imagine, so different. Born out of dysfunction of the modern states of Iraq and Syria and out of a deep sectarian divide. It has no constitution. No country recognizes its borders. It is at war with every country in the region. It is a member of no international organizations. It persecutes all other faiths and forces conversion. And its economy relies on smuggling oil, extortion, kidnapping, and financial aid from sympathizers. And the irony is the two states are rivals against each other, absolute rivals. Iran views ISIS as a terrorist group, what an irony, that has betrayed Islam. And it has taken a leading role fighting de facto on the same side of the United States in fighting the Islamic State. ISIS, in turn, regards Shiites as apostates, which should be killed to pave the way for a purer Islam. So that's a microcosm. Together, the different factions across the region have altered the Middle East arguably more than any single political phenomena since they became modern states in the past century. They're redefining politics in virtually every country, even where they're not allowed to run, and they're changing borders. We're seeing that happen in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq. The danger is what happens to Yemen. Does it fall back into too? With a rippling effect worldwide. I'll close with this very interesting poll done by the University of Maryland. Our perception of our national security challenges has long been shaped by Islamist movements. But today, the poll found that Americans overwhelmingly, by 70%, identify the Islamic State as the main threat to the United States. 70%. The next two top threats, the Palestinian conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict, 13%, and Iran, 12%. All three involve Islamist movements in some way. So that is a kind of the American prism on what this challenge represents for our own national security interests. But it's so interesting that some of these movements are in conflict with each other along the way. Now I want to turn it over to, we'll begin with Nathan, and he's going to look at Egypt and the Palestinians, and I'd love to know what your bottom lines are out of that are recent, current, that reflect what's happened since the first edition of this book came out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robin. The instructions that she gave me are very, very clear. It's what are your half dozen bottom lines, cover two countries, talk about the present and the future, and be brief. So that's what I'm going to do, okay? Let me just make just a couple overall comments, and then I've only got three bottom lines, okay? A couple overall comments about what's happening with Islamist movements in general. One thing that I think or I would say a couple things that I think color or should color the analysis a little bit more than they do. Number one, these and a lot of the movements that we're talking about are organizations, and we sometimes forget that because we study a region in which most of the political organizations that exist are official; they're part of the state. And if you're talking about people outside of the state, you usually talk about influential individuals, charismatic leaders, and this sort of thing. Islamist movements are remarkable. And one thing that I notice is if you interview somebody from an Islamist movement, almost all sentences begin with the word we. You interview a non-Islamist politician, and all sentences begin with the word "I." Okay, so these are organizations, and that really affects, I think, how they operate. So, you take and some, with Hamas, it's been tried. You eliminate the top leadership, they're replaced. So these are organizations that can sustain themselves over the generations. So the question is kind of what's going on with the current and future generations. The second thing. I think that should color our analysis a little bit more is we tend to look at Islamists. These are movements that kind of ground themselves in some kind of understanding of their religion, and that gives us and their ideological movements, and that gives us a very strong temptation to try to look into their souls. Well, I'm a political scientist. I can't see souls, but what I can see is behavior, and that behavior is one that I think is very heavily conditioned by their environment. These are organizations that are very much shaped by the political environment in which they're operating. Their ideologies actually tend to be very, very vague and very, very plastic. And so to understand how they operate, you often have to take a look at the political context. So with those sort of overall sort of frameworks in mind, what are my three bottom lines? And I actually just have three words. Number one, politics, or in a sense, turning away from the primacy of politics. There was something that dominated an awful lot of the Islamist movements in the region really over the last generation or so, and that was what I might call a political project. The idea that an Islamist movement could was doing all kinds of different things, could refashion itself, at least in part, as a political movement oriented towards elections, gaining seats. Most of them didn't think they were going to win, a few did, but most of them thought that if they entered the political process, ran for seats in parliament, they might get a share of power, they might be able to get their idea out, they could operate a little bit more openly, and there seemed to be kind of a political unfreezing in the area as a whole, and that certainly happened with both the Muslim Brotherhood, which invested very, very heavily in politics, and Hamas, which decided after very serious internal deliberation to enter the 2006 parliamentary elections. So that was in essence where the current generation of leaders led the movements. That hasn't gotten them exactly what they expected, and that's what I think that they will have to be dealing with. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is now dealing with an extremely different environment, and one in which the idea of let's just kind of sit down and run for parliament and participate like everybody else sounds stupid. It just isn't going to happen. And the movement is really trying to come to grips with how to refashion themselves in an environment in which an awful lot of the leadership is in jail. That which isn't in jail is out of the country. An awful lot of the decision-making day-to-day has to be devolved onto the grassroots, on which it's not quite clear whether the older generation controls the younger generation. This is an incredibly hierarchical movement that all of a sudden is operating in an environment in which hierarchy doesn't operate very well. So the end of kind of the primacy of politics is very big for the Muslim Brotherhood. For Hamas, it's a little bit different. It's that they ran and they won, and now they're trying to deal with the consequences. And they've discovered that kind of holding on to political power, which they've done in Gaza since 2007. Is as much a liability as an asset. It ties them down. And they're trying to come to grips right now with the fact they are supposed to be the movement of Islamic resistance. And the line I like to give is that they find themselves like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Not holy, not Roman, not an empire. And so Hamas is not a movement, it's not Islamic, and it's not resisting. And this is what has happened when they've sort of found themselves entrenched in Gaza. They're trying to find a way out of it. And they can't. So they're kind of stuck, but the current leadership and I think the next generation will deal with the consequences, or is trying to deal with the consequences of having political power and finding that it doesn't bring them any closer to their goal of an Islamic Palestine. So that's the first shift. A second shift, I think, has to do with violence. The current leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, the top senior leadership, dealt with a movement that kind of would sometimes get involved in violence on the back in the 30s and the 40s and so on. The former general guide of the Muslim Brotherhood was a member of the special apparatus. Mahdi Akif, who stepped down in 2009, was a member of the special apparatus, which was sort of a paramilitary wing of the Brotherhood. When the Brotherhood reemerged in Egypt in the 70s and 80s, that generation said, we found out what happened when we go down that road, and it doesn't lead us very, very far. We've got to refashion the movement so that it's completely an above ground and completely a nonviolent movement. And so we've got to reinterpret our legacy in such a way as we want to repudiate that. Nonviolence in Egypt doesn't sound very good in Islamist circles right now. And part of it is kind of the external pressure. I mean, kind of the rise of Daesh, which is not necessarily going to recruit many Egyptians, but kind of seems to be doing something unlike the Brotherhood. And part of it is this decentralization and the feeling on the part of many of the movement's cadres who are still in Egypt that they are exposed to violence on a daily basis, and they have to respond in kind. And so violence is on the agenda. I spoke with one senior Muslim Brotherhood leader recently. I'd spoken to him back in 2010, December 2010, right before the Egyptian uprising, and he said this is the darkest days in Egyptian political history that we've ever experienced. Worse oppression than we've ever faced. I thought that was a little bit of a hyperbole, but I said, well, so what do you say to somebody who's a junior member of the movement who comes to you and says, we can't take this anymore, it's time to hit the regime back? And he says, oh no, we do hear such things, and here's what we say to our junior members. We say to them, or I say to them, look, you say you want democracy in Egypt. Do you practice democracy in your own family? How do you treat your siblings? How do you treat your kids? How do you treat your parents? Come back when you have a democratic family life, and then we'll worry about building democracy in Egypt. In other words, I mean, this is part of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. It's improve yourself, and then we'll move on to the entire society. When I spoke to him recently, his attitude was very, very different. It's like, what am I supposed to say to somebody who's like watched, his people next to him get shot dead? I can't tell him to be nonviolent. That he's not going to listen to me. So that the movement is getting sucked into, I think, this violence in a way that, as I say, the current generation of leaders tried to push them against. Hamas's relationship with violence is a little bit more complicated, but essentially what they found is that they can if they give up, they are convinced, the current leadership is convinced that if they give up the armed option, then they basically give away the organization. On the other hand, they cannot use it for anything other than short-term or tactical goals. So again, they're kind of in this cul-de-sac, and violence seems to be part of the problem. But also, or their insistence that they want to rely on resistance, which takes violent forms, is part of the problem about why it is that they can't kind of break out of their shell. On the other hand, if they give it up, they are convinced that they will be eliminated as a movement. And final word that I want to talk about is recruitment. We tend to look at the top leadership of these movements, but I think Robin is right. We may be looking for a generational shift. So you have to think about where are the current members of the movement going to come from. And I think this is something that will have big effect on the organizations over the coming years. In Egypt, in the 80s or 90s, if you were sort of a semi-pious but politically engaged college student at Cairo University or Alexandria or something, you usually went through a brotherhood phase. Okay? Some people stuck, some people left, but the brotherhood was a cool place to kind of be for a little bit. That's not the case right now. The path that the Brotherhood represented looks like it was much less persuasive, I think. My guess is right now the Brotherhood, the Brotherhood that built itself up to a powerful presence within Egyptian society in the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s is suddenly confronting an environment in which they are now back to being an underground movement. And that's going to very much color the sort of people who come into the movement and what it is that they're looking at the movement for and who it is that the Brotherhood is competing against in terms of trying to get recruitments. Hamas has got a very, very different problem. They are not an underground movement in Gaza. They're essentially governing Gaza, so they have no problem kind of attracting people in there. In the West Bank, they're an underground movement. And when they were founded, they had a solid anchoring in the Palestinian diaspora in some places, Kuwait and Jordan and so on. Right now, this is a Gaza movement. And and my guess is that the effect of being such a powerful governing presence in Gaza, but having very little organizational presence anywhere else, including on the West Bank, makes them increasingly a Gaza movement and much less a Palestinian movement and much less an Islamic movement, and that's not the movement that the founders thought that they were building.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nathan. David is going to take a look at North Africa, from Morocco all the way through Libya.
This is on, yeah. I'm glad Nathan went first, because what really strikes me is how different the Maghreb is from the Islamic world of Egypt and the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza. When I speak of Maghreb here, I'm leaving out Libya. I'm going to talk mostly about Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And what strikes me the most with what's happened over since the Arab Spring is how the Islamic movements have been involved in politics in the Maghreb, particularly in Algeria, all the way back to 1995. So it isn't the first time they've come to power. The main Algerian Islamic Party had ministers in the government in 1995. But what you see, what strikes me, is how pragmatic the Islamic groups that are involved, parties that are involved in politics are, compared to what you've just heard about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Islamic parties in first Tunisia, Robin's already talked about how they came to power and they left power and graciously gave it up without abandoning politics altogether. And we're ready to go into the opposition, but they are now part of the new government that was just formed, at least with one minister. In Algeria, they had been in politics, as I said, in the government since 1995. They finally got out in 2012 because they were crushed in the elections of 2012 by no less than the old single party of Algeria, the FLN, the Front for National Liberation, which came out on top by far. And they did leave the government, although a couple of their people decided to leave the party and form a new party, but stay in the government. And in Morocco, the king changed the constitution because of the Arab Spring in 2011. And among the changes, he agreed to appoint the prime minister from the party that won the elections. And lo and behold, in the elections of 2011, the Party for Justice and Development, PJD, won the elections, and the king appointed the leader of the PJD as prime minister. And he's been there ever since. So what I'm saying is that no matter whether they're in government or out of government in Algeria, or in government, out government, left government, came back, they're all involved in the political process. They're all engaging. Now, sure, there are Salafis that are not engaging. In Algeria, the Salafis have never been involved in politics, believe it or not. And still are not today. They have no political party. They never tried to get involved, compared to what we've seen in Egypt, where they went into the elections and won a quarter of the vote in 2012. So, yeah, there are Salafi groups that are all across. I'm reminded of the diversity of Salafi groups when Marina and I were in Morocco, I think it's a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. We were talking to a representative of one of the Salafi groups. And I said, well, how many Salafi groups are there in Morocco? And he started naming all these different tendencies among the Salafis in Morocco, and I think he got to 5, including one tendency that followed somebody from Pakistan. So talk about the variety of Islamic groups, even in Salafi groups, that's really quite remarkable. But to me, what's remarkable is that despite what's happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in the Maghreb, again, leaving out Libya, which is such a mess, we don't know who's on top and what's going to happen. But the other 3 countries, the Islamists have stayed involved, been involved since 1995 in the case of Algeria. They've come to power as a result of the Arab Spring, and some of them have been kicked out of government, but they're still in the political process. So despite all their difficulties, particularly in Morocco, where the PJD really has nothing to show for being in power for 3 years, although it staked its reputation on solving the economic and social problems of the country, which, as some really difficult to deal with. They're still there. The king, they sometimes have run-ins with the king, but they're determined to get along with the king. Very pragmatic. And their leader, Prime Minister Ben Kiran, said the other day, he had an interview with Sharq al-Awsat. He said, I'm not an Islamist, I'm a Muslim. I'm here to solve the problems of the country. Now, for a party that's supposed to be Islamic, that's quite a statement. And so I continue to be amazed that they're staying engaged, although they've all had tremendous difficulties in their initial or past experiences with being in government.
Thank you, David. I think that brings up the point that we need to understand that there are Islamists who want and are willing now to be part of the democratic process. They have crossed an important threshold. They are prepared to coexist with other secular parties, multiple secular parties. And I think that's really what we're all hoping happens down the road. But it does reflect the fact that those who question whether democracy and Islam are compatible have now proof in certain countries that they are willing and able to function. They are willing to lose elections and to cooperate with those who beat them. And that's an important one. I now want to turn it over to Les, who deals with Yemen and the Gulf and the very exciting and newsworthy subject, particularly of Yemen.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks to Jane and others at the Wilson Center for having us and being part of making this book possible. I find myself just listening so far in thinking about the sort of big picture trends. I'll probably start agreeing with what Nathan was saying, and maybe we'll find that the Maghreb is an exception, because I think this idea of the end of the primacy of politics for the Islamists seems to fit the Gulf-Yemen paradigm right now. What we're seeing certainly in Yemen, but I think we're also seeing it in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, is that the traditional political Islamists, the ones that are related both in their ideas and in their actions, their ideology to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that follow that trend, we're seeing them on the defensive, and that's to put it very mildly. In Yemen, the party that I know the most about, Islah, it's a tribal group, and for those of you who know Yemen, I won't spend too much time on Yemen. Islah represents tribal leaders, the largest tribe, the Hashid tribe, but more relevant to today's discussion, they have a very strong, organized political party. They have a Secretary General, Mohammed al-Yadumi, who very much sees himself in the mold of Ennahda. I think he would almost without question say that is the kind of party that Islah is, and that's the kind of party he runs. Islah under Yadumi has participated in government many times when they've had the opportunity. They do participate. They participated in the government that was just overthrown by the Houthis. They had ministers in important spots. They see themselves, Islah saw themselves or do see themselves as building the state, not tearing the state down. The last time I was in Yemen, it wasn't too long ago, I sat with Yadumi, and he said, we were talking about the Houthis, who at that time had taken over Amran, which was a stronghold of Islah because it was the home of the largest tribe. And when I asked Yadumi about fighting and the recourse to violence and whether or not this would cause violence, he said, when was the last time, I'm paraphrasing, but he said almost exactly this, when was the last time you heard the sentence, air quotes, Islah captured X town? And I said, I haven't heard that. He said, because we don't capture towns. We're part of the state. We're trying to protect the state. And it's the Houthis that are capturing towns and trying to tear them away from the state, and that's not what we're doing. So I think that it's relevant to this conversation because that type of Islamism in Yemen, and I would argue in the Gulf, is on the wane, and now we're seeing the rise of the non-state actors and militias. So non-state being al-Qaeda in Yemen, and a militia, the Houthis, who despite calling themselves Ansar Allah and pretending they have a party, they don't have a party. It's a conglomeration of fighters, basically, without any particular agenda. So you're having the traditional Islamists being pushed aside by the non-state actors and the militias. And it's interesting, in Yemen, the Houthis have now dissolved the parliament. They have rejected they say they haven't, but they really have rejected the work of the National Dialogue Committee. And both the Parliament and the National Dialogue Committee in Yemen, in fact, the political process of the last 3 years, were Islah vehicles. Islah they were a driving force behind the whole idea of a dialogue to draft a new constitution and to move forward. That was an Islah idea that other parties joined into. And so the Houthis have now shoved those things aside. Islah was powerful within the parliament. That's been dissolved and shoved aside. And so I mention this because now what does a more traditional Islamist party like Islah does, where its political vehicles have been destroyed. They no longer exist. So the idea of the Ennahda style idea of participating in government, of competing for power, of being nonviolent, but pursuing your ends, I should say, through the means of politics, is no longer available to Islah. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see how they react to this. I think right now they're trying to keep their powder dry, but they, I suspect without the organs, without the institutions, they'll have to change. And I think, and probably this deserves a larger discussion, but maybe this is relevant to how Hamas reacts or how the Muslim Brotherhood reacts. If they are denied access to political institutions, in Yemen denied access through force, but in Egypt and in Palestine denied access because the powers that be have decided that they shall not access anything that might give them political levers, what are they going to be left to? And looking at the rest of the Gulf, I think it kind of fits into this little analytical framework, in the sense that the Gulf governments, the Emiratis are right now the strongest on this, where they have an absolute allergy to anything that even remotely resembles Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you may know that NDI's office, we had a small office in Dubai that did absolutely no work in the Emirates. We just used it as a sort of a jumping off point and an organizational office for work in other countries. It was shut down because there was and we honestly, I don't even know what they heard or what they're thinking. Someone in the Emirates had heard that NDI had some training seminar where some kind of Muslim Brotherhood people attended. We didn't, that I know of, certainly didn't in the Gulf, but they just heard that, and that was enough for them to shut down the office and actually pin down our staff there for more than 2 months. They wouldn't let them leave the country. I mean, they're crazy. They're trying to kind of stamp this out, and the Saudis do that as well. And so you have this potential, and it's happening actually quite quickly in Yemen. I would argue the broader Gulf region, the Arabian Peninsula, that you're going to have, you're going to have basically authoritarian figures or authoritarian governments, and you're going to have extremists. And so this idea of the political Islamists, which did exist in Yemen, certainly, I think they're in danger of being squeezed out. They're obviously in danger of being squeezed out, I think, as Nathan argued in Egypt. The room for that type of political Islam, as we've known it in the last, the second generation, seems to be disappearing. So, maybe I'll just briefly mention a little bit more about Al-Qaeda and the Houthis. The complication, I've sort of laid out a framework that has to do with the political Islamists. Yemen, of course, is an exception. It's almost always an exception. It's an exception to this tidy thing because it has Al-Qaeda in the south and in some of the tribal areas. And it's already a place of proxy battles. There's some Iranian influence behind the Houthis. How much we don't know, but there's no question that there's some Iranian mischief making with the Houthis. The Houthis are the enemy of Al-Qaeda. It's not clear that Al-Qaeda is the friend of Saudi Arabia, but I'm not sure that they quite know. But certainly, as the Houthis gain strength, and you've probably seen the news that yesterday the American ambassador was removed from Sinai, which I don't remember that ever happening. No matter how bad things got in Yemen, the ambassador's never been removed, in my memory anyway. Now been removed, which tells me that things are very bad. And pretty soon, I think we're going to see the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of scenario where the Houthis perhaps start to look a little bit attractive because they will fight Al-Qaeda and probably be relatively effective at that. But the second that starts happening, the Saudis may decide that Al-Qaeda or some variation of Al-Qaeda, they may not call it Al-Qaeda, but some variation of Sunni extremism is preferable to Iranian domination of Yemen. And so the whole proxy battle and the whole civil war scenario starts to become very real very quickly if that's where Yemen goes. I won't go on too much about this because how much this has to do with political Islam, probably not much. But these groups all call themselves, or they all say that they're motivated by Islam. But putting aside that for 1 second, what this does in Yemen, and I think to some extent in the Gulf, there are some similarities, is it sets the stage for a complete rollback of political reform. In other words, if the dominant debate, the dominant feeling, the dominant factor in the country, it becomes security, becomes rolling back the gains of extremists, whether it's Sunni extremists or Shia extremists, then that sets the stage for either the re-entry in the case of Yemen, re-entry, or for the strengthening of the strong man or the strong regime. So I think what we'll see in Yemen is some kind of re-entry of former President Saleh and or his son and or the people that were around him, and he will then be able to say, I'm the only choice, or the people around me, the only choice to fight back these extremists of both types, the Al-Qaeda type extremists or the Zaydi Shia extremists, the Houthis. And I think that this type of scenario strengthens the Gulf regimes, at least temporarily, because they can make the same argument. But I'll just finish in terms of the bottom line that goes back to the pre-Arab Spring times, which is I think we already know how the story ends. If the situation in the region becomes, and I think again the Maghreb is an exception here, but let's go from Libya all the way to Yemen. If the situation becomes that it's a choice between Islamic extremists of various flavors, violent ones, or strongmen, military dictators, or strongmen of any kind of flavor, and there is nothing in the middle, and particularly not these state-oriented, participatory, moderate Islamist parties, we already know how that story ends. It ends in further inflaming of violence, and it ends up in further revolutions and further upheavals and further uprisings. And I'm afraid that that's where this is going in the, not even the long run, I think, in the short to medium term. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Les. It reminds me very much in our discussion of Sam Huntington's book on the third wave. I staunchly disagree with him about the clash of civilizations, but I do think he was spot on when he wrote about it takes 3 waves of democracy, 3 attempts at democracy before the original seeds actually are able to grow into something that is enduring. And I think we're obviously, in that first wave still. I wonder, I'd love to get your thoughts on a couple of things. One, when you look at the region and how the borders have changed so much or are threatened with change. In Yemen, you look at what happened in Iraq and Syria, and the fact is that Lebanon's population now has been reconfigured by now that a quarter of his population is Syrian refugees. The 4th largest city in Jordan is Syrian refugees. What else? Libya is beginning to fall apart. How else might the borders change? These were artificially drawn borders by Europeans a century ago in most, not all places. If we were to look out, we were on the National Intelligence Council, and we had to look 15 years down the road. Think big, think different, think what are the possibilities? You want to begin with that, Nathan?
Anchored as I am primarily in Egypt, the idea that states are artificial creations, external creations, doesn't make much sense, right? The Egyptian state is literally older than the pyramids. So my perspective will be a little bit different. What I will say is that it strikes me that it's not so much a question of borders. It may be in a few places, but it is increasingly a question of the line between domestic and regional politics being erased or dissolving. When you talk to political actors in the region, like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they were aware of regional trends, but they thought primarily in the domestic political context. And the other people that they were worried about were usually domestic. And they might kind of look to another country for sort of like ideas or models, but usually it would be like, we're not like them. We're going to do things our way. What we're witnessing right now is, I think, an environment in which trends easily move across borders and developments in one country affect developments like another. This is going back, in a sense, to Malcolm Curl's classic book on the Arab Cold War. in which ideological battles do cross borders. So that I do think that we're not necessarily going to see a redrawing of the political map in terms of where you cross from one country to another, but we are, I think, increasingly seeing a region in which political developments in one country, and most of the political developments, I'm kind of jealous of Dave because you've got some good news to report. Most of us don't have good news to report. And the bad news in one country really begins to have effects in destabilizing and in some ways, I think, making politics much edgier in a neighboring country.
Can I jump in? Just again, I think that the area from Iraq, Syria, and on, countries that share borders and where the common lineage is the Arabian Peninsula and or Persia, are a little different. And I do think that, and again, this is maybe beyond the scope of this discussion, but you are seeing, I think, the very beginnings of an important realignment that have to do with Shia empowerment. And it's interesting that the Shia parties that are the strongest at the moment, and that will I think be a part of this. I think there will be a redrawing of borders to some extent. All happen to characterize themselves for the moment as Islamist. So the Houthis, Ansar Allah, they certainly would like to put themselves forward. They have this sort of Hezbollah style kind of. I think it's kind of phony because I don't think they've even thought it through. But they like to adopt the same slogans and so on. They're definitely Hezbollah light right now. But in Iraq, you can argue which parties are the most moderate or not moderate, but you've got Dawa, you've got ISKI, the former SCIRI, the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution. You've got al-Haq in Bahrain. I don't necessarily think al-Wifaq, but you have harder line parties. And these parties, if trends continue, will align themselves more and more with Iran, not as a state, but as an idea, an Islamic republic type idea, and they're quickly the tentacles are joining together. They have geographic contiguity, if that's the word, continuity, the contiguous geography, and there will be at some stage, if this continues kind of apace, some, if not an actual redrawing of international borders, certainly the kind of interethnic boundary lines, as they used to say in Bosnia, will become drawn, and militias will start to set out borders as they're already doing in Yemen, and I think that this will start to spread. So I think we will see that.
Yeah, I think both the reaction to a century of having outsiders determine who's who kind of comes up against globalization, and at a moment when your sense of who you are often draws you back to your primordial identities as a tribe or a clan or a Sunni or a Shiite, and that all of this comes together, the Shiite-Sunni conflict in so many places, the globalization, and suddenly it forces people to think small rather than big, and that may be part of what happens not just in the Middle East but elsewhere. David, since you've got the one good news story, I was going to ask you, the one thing about Islamists, like communists, is that they create utopian dreams, ideals, and agendas, and they can't deliver. They face the same vulnerability, and one of the problems is in all of these countries in the Arab world, unemployment is such a huge problem. A third, at least, even in Saudi Arabia, unemployment among the young is over 30% in an oil-rich country, and so. How vulnerable does that make the Islamist period? I think that was one of the problems with Ennahda during its period, when it actually didn't have a mandate to rule, but it was expected to address all of those things. And as the Muslim Brotherhood and others end up being forced aside, is there a sense that those who work within the system are the losers, and that's not the road to take? And so we see the Algeria model, which is the chapter you wrote, Algeria from the 1980s or 1990s, when they tried the democratic transition and ended up in a decade-long civil war, and should be a lesson to us all.
Well, they have to, the Islamists that have engaged in the Maghreb, they have two problems. One is those who have gone into government, they have to show their followers that it pays off to be part of the system. That's one challenge. And in Algeria, you see the Islamists, the main the main Islamic party, the movement of the Society for Peace, almost split in half about whether to stay in the government and after the 2012 elections, and the main body got out because they had up to 7 ministers in the government, and they were having trouble justifying being in the government, and so some of them were in a three-part alliance supporting Bouteflika for president. Well, that really gets your hands dirty. So they have to show that you get something out of being in government. And in Algeria, they're having a real problem they've had a real problem doing that, and therefore they've withdrawn. And then if your platform is that I'm going to work and solve the problems of the country, economic and social, you've got to deliver. And the PJD in Morocco has not been able to deliver, and the one thing that has happened, the government cut subsidies, and this was very unpopular, while the prime minister of the country was an Islamist. So it's a real challenge. And whether they can now the polls are still saying, it's interesting, the polls in Morocco still say the PJD is popular, just after 3 years. And in Tunisia, where you would have thought, Ennahda was finished after 2 years in government and this mobilization against them, they still got in the elections last year 27% of the vote, and the winning party got 37. So even after being in government and not doing anything, and sort of losing out in the effort to have a kind of Islamic constitution, and even though Ghanouchi said, why do we want Sharia in the Constitution? Nobody knows what it means. And this guy's an Islamist. I mean, so you would have thought that he would have lost a lot of support. But they still won 27% of the vote. So they have staying power in society. And if you allow them to participate, no matter what they're unable to accomplish, they still seem to maintain a fair amount of popularity.
I actually saw Ghanouchi in December when we were there for the presidential vote, and he said the Islamists no longer have the support to rule, which I thought was, a pretty magnanimous thing to say. I want to open it up to your questions. I think there are microphones on the side, and is that Bill? Back here. Please give us your name and affiliation.
Bill Lawrence from George Washington University. Two sort of question points. One is the phenomenon, particularly in the Maghreb, of palace Islamists. I think the fault line now is those who are willing to align with regimes that aren't necessarily popular and those that aren't. So the biggest movement, of course, in Algeria is the FIS, which is still banned, right? And they're sort of still out. And then you've got these palace Islamists that have been in since '95. And in Morocco, you've got the palace Islamists, and you've got Adl Ihsan, which is arguably bigger. So I just wanted to sort of ask about that phenomenon of palace versus anti-palace Islamists. And then in terms of Salafi politics, you've got Salafi parties in Morocco and Algeria now. The Algerians ones haven't run. But you've got this phenomenon of the Noor party in Egypt, right, which turns it over to Nathan a little bit. Salafis in power, Salafis aligning with regimes. This is another piece of this puzzle. And the second sort of point, which I'll make very quick, and I would characterize this all as strange bedfellows and unholy alliances. And with a brief nod to Libya, we know who's up in Libya. We don't not know. We've got an alliance of Islamist and secular forces fighting an alliance of tribal, secular, and former regime forces. And it's in many ways an extension, as Nathan was saying, of what's going on in Algeria, and very highly influenced by Algeria. It's also influenced a little bit by Tunisia in interesting ways. But increasingly, I think Islamists are influencing politics more than ever through pacts, alliances, and different kinds of contestation. And who they ally with is not who you would necessarily expect them to ally with. So that's sort of the point question for the panel. Thanks.
No, I don't understand whether it's a commentary or a question. Yeah, they are making these odd alliances. They're learning how to get along with people you wouldn't expect them to. But that's part of the political process. And that's what I'm amazed how in the Maghreb you have these Islamic parties that are willing to engage with strange bedfellows. But that's how you learn politics, and I think it's a welcome development, whether they're in or out of power.
I wanted to ask these guys too, and then there's a question from Marina, but you mentioned Salafis. I mean, in many ways, the decision by Salafis to be part of the political process has really changed the political dynamic. Salafis traditionally had sought to wait for their reward in heaven. They were oblivious, apolitical, deliberately among the Sunnis, and it was the moment when they decided to enter the modern political world that changed the face of politics across the region. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all, what difference it makes, either one of you.
I'll take an initial stab. I mean, I think that back to Bill's question, Hizb ut-Noor in Egypt, the Salafi party, would have loved to have been a palace party, and they're getting rejected for the role, and they don't quite know what to do. I think what happened with Salafis is, I mean, in the countries that I'm most familiar with, they had this different attitude towards politics, but they also had brotherhood envy. And so they would usually follow what the Brotherhood was doing 10 years afterwards. They didn't come to politics quite so easily. They weren't quite sure about building political parties. Their organizations, when they existed, were just kind of structured in a way that lent themselves, I think, to like electoral politics an awful lot easily. But when they saw the Brotherhood moving, they would often follow. It happened in Egypt, and it happened in Kuwait. It's happened in a few other places as well. The turn away from politics in these places, I think, means that when the Salafis discuss among themselves, the kind of approaches towards the political realm are not dominated anymore by electoral politics and by political parties like they would have been just a few years ago. So I think what we're seeing is a return, and the question that now is quietism, jihadism, varieties of jihadism. These are kind of the debates, and it's, to me, a very unhealthy development. I would go back to what David said about their inclusion as normal political actors would have been a healthy political development in some countries, and I think it's being reversed.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you have just among the Salafis their own spectrum, where you have the Noor party in Egypt who has participated, run for parliament, even run female candidates because it was required to. And then you have ISIS, which is Salafi too. And so, we talk about this big spectrum. The spectrum has so many, many layers and degrees and kind of tentacles.
Can I just actually, sorry, Marina, but just a quick comment on Bill's other issue about the PACs that I just wanted to add to the list because I didn't mention this, and it's an important thing. In the chapter in the book on Yemen, I spent a lot of time on the Yemeni Socialist Party Pact, which was very, very important for a long time. But it was the precursor, and I think that other countries have done this. I was in Iraq not too long ago and reminded there that there is quite a strong political bargain between the party that's now called ISKI, which used to be the Iran-oriented party, not really anymore, and a series of secular parties as well as Sunni parties. And so they're quite strong within the parliament, and they work together. I agree with your characterization of Libya, that you have an Islamist secular coalition fighting against the former regime. It's simplifying it, but it's something like that. And I think in Tunis, what you're seeing is Ennahda, I think, really kind of going way out of their way to participate in this government that is quite hostile, actually, to them, but finding a way to participate. And what I think is in common in those four examples, I think there are others, is that the Islamists, the moderate political Islamists that we are talking about, not the Salafis, want to protect the political freedoms that exist so they can live to fight another day. And I think that that's why they participate in these coalitions. Whether or not that works in the long run, we don't know, but I think it's important to them to live to fight another day. So.
And Ennahda, when it was in power, was the first Islamist government to go after Islamic extremists.
Right.
And that was a hard decision, and they tried to negotiate with them, come on, brothers, come on in, and realized they couldn't, went after them and killed them as they were crossing the border.
And I
And
think
that
we-
was a
yeah.
really important turning point, a hard one for them.
But we'd have a different situation in Egypt today if the Muslim Brotherhood had reached out and brought Mohammed al-Baradei or some other group into that government. That would have changed the dynamics entirely. They didn't, different topic, but I mean, they didn't do it, so. Sorry, Maria.
Marina.
Okay, Nathan talked about the importance of the context that these Islamist organizations respond to. The context. I think we need to look at the context a little more, because those countries where the Islamists are turning against politics are countries where I would argue politics is finished for the duration. There is no politics in Egypt. I mean, if you look, which is a funny thing to say for a country which is about to have elections, but if you look at what is happening, most of the so-called secular parties are think right now that politics is over. One after another, they are saying they are not going to run for elections. Then the next day they'd say again, no, maybe we will run. I mean, they go back and forth and so on. But essentially, there is a sense that the official political process is dead, and it's totally meaningless. So that in a sense, it's not just the Islamists that are turning their back to politics, is that there is no space to politics. And in many ways, and this is the last, maybe too broad a comment, but the Arab world is going back to what has been sort of the default position, that except for a very few countries, and those are the Maghreb countries, politics does not exist. That or at least that the efforts of the regimes, of all regimes, are directed at stopping politics. You talk about the Emirates, Les, certainly Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are all, in most of the Arab world, the politics has been a dirty word, and it's going back to being a dirty word, I think.
I wouldn't bet my money that endures. But that's, I mean, I just think they're setting themselves up for more trouble.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Let's take the final two questions, Mike, and over here.
At 30,000 feet, Sunni Islam has been in ascendancy since the Iranian Revolution, and Shia Islam has been in disarray, and the disarray continues. My question is taking you beyond your mandate this morning about the U.S. role. Is there a U.S. role? What should we do and not do? Are we a bystander as Sunni Islam in disarray goes through several more renditions, different trends, fads, if you will?
Who wants to take that? You want to start?
I think the United States government is not very well structured to handle religious conflicts on the other side of the world. So if we think about it that way, then we're not going to get very far. I would combine your comment with Marina's comment, though, however. I mean, what's essentially, so if we look even at something like, the Sunni-Shia divide, sectarianism, this is, yes, it's something rooted in Islam's origins and political disputes since then, and it's also rooted much, much more in current politics. This is a sectarian divide which became politicized for various kinds of reasons within the last a decade or so. And so what's basically going on here, I think, is an unhealthy political process in these countries, or as Marina says, I think it's I think she's right. It is a political process that is being stamped out in some places. When I first went to Egypt in the early 1980s, you went into a coffee house and they were showing a soccer game. Okay, you looked at what people read the newspaper all the time. They read the obituaries and the sports pages. Okay, that's different now. You go into a coffee house, or they're still watching satellite TV. So you still got political engagement, and you've still got people who are very quick to take the problems in their lives and translate them into political terms and public policy terms. What's broken are the political mechanisms, political parties, elections, political process, and so on. And you've got regimes in power in most of these countries where they do exist that are trying to stamp it out, or in other countries where the entire state apparatus is threatened. That's not good. And so, I mean, sort of, so what's a policy response to unhealthy politics? The only thing that I can say is that these are good, these are long-term trends. And we have a policy process that's very geared to short-term to short-term concerns. And the immediate short-term concern here would be essentially preserving bilateral relations with an awful lot of these governments that are, in a sense, part of the problem. I don't think that's a healthy response. I think we will pay for it in the long run. So I don't have any kind of magic bullet, but I will say that pretending that or identifying too much with political systems that are, I think, trying to bring back an era which isn't worth restoring will lead us into problems over the coming years.
Can I jump in, Robin? Just keeping with the 30,000-foot thing, but I'm going to jump into an area of Hala's great expertise and not mine. But I think it's relevant because you asked Mike what can or what should the U.S. do, but the U.S. is actually, I think, inadvertently doing something extremely big right now, which is trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, right in the middle of all of this that we just talked about, right in the middle of this, the insecurity in the Gulf around what's going on, right in the middle of the proxy battles and the very real battles with ISIS and so on. And perhaps by June there will be some sort of interim deal, which in the Gulf will be viewed as kind of a lose-lose situation for them. If a deal or not, they lose. And Iran, I think, probably if you kind of game it out, Iran becomes strengthened or resurgent as a result of a deal. Almost with no question, it becomes strengthened or resurgent as a result of no deal. And either way, it plays into the fears of Sunni Shia empowerment. It plays into the rise of various forces and so on that are disrupting the traditional alliances, disrupting the comfort level with the traditional alliances. And I think it's very strongly viewed in the region, the reaching out to Iran, as a very strong kind of thumb on the scale in terms of the eventual outcome of this realignment restructuring that's going on in the region, particularly in the Gulf area. So I don't think that policymakers here necessarily see the Iran negotiations as such a heavy foray into Middle East policy, but I think that's what it will be, and that's how it is seen in the Gulf. So I don't know where that leaves us, but I think it's seen as a very heavy play to influence the restructuring that's going on in the region.
Can I just come down to 1 foot above the ground
Yeah.
instead of 30? And in Iraq, if the U.S. doesn't do something to force or pressure the Iranian-backed Shiite government in Baghdad to find a political solution that includes the Sunnis, then Iraq is finished as we see it. And I know our military preparations, but I don't know what our political efforts are to force this, a new confederation, or how you bring in the Sunnis to find a political solution to make any kind of military success that we're trying to pull off to keep that country together. And I don't see the U.S. putting enough pressure on the central government to find a political solution. Maybe something's happening, but I don't see it.
I would just say one thing, because I think Mike always asks the question of the hour. You look at the case of Kayla Mueller, the sweet girl whose death has been confirmed, held hostage by ISIS. She was a victim of ISIS, but she was also a victim of a dysfunctional architecture in the whole region. And we tend to get so locked into what is today's problem and not see the bigger trends. And this is an existential crisis for a lot of the states in the region. Egypt is separate because it has a long identity, a major place, a large population, people who have an Egyptian identity. A lot of these other places are still in that strange formative period, and that is clashing up against the era of globalization, and what that means for what is the basic form of governance, what is your primary source of identity, where are your loyalties to, be it as a Kurd or Shiite or Sunni or an Iraqi, that we're not going to get answers to this war until we look at that very, very big question, which has affected everybody in the region. It's not just ISIS. It's not just the Syrian-Iraq war. It is now the whole kit and caboodle. And nobody's kind of looking at the big stuff. We're so caught up in, well, do we arm the rebels and so forth. And we've got, the tragedy of the original Afghan war with the Soviets, the second Afghan war with the United States, our Iraq war, our intervention in Lebanon, all pull into one at a time of, great sense of empowerment. And everybody in the region's looking for someone to represent them, some way to be part of the process, and they're getting a lot of different answers. Some Islamists willing to work within the system are delivering platforms, agendas, and so forth, but there are an awful lot of others who feel the system at every level has failed them. The government, the traditional parties, opposition parties, and so forth, and that's why they join ISIS. In the meantime, they've got to, support themselves. So anyway, I think there's a lot at stake there. I'm sorry I can't hear your question because I promised to wrap it up at 11, but I'm sure they'd be willing to stay behind and answer your question. Please join me in thanking my three extraordinary colleagues, Les Campbell, Nathan Brown, and David Ottaway.